Hello, psychology students. Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to our lecture on IQ testing. So basically what we're going to do is give you a little history of the IQ itself in terms of the tests and show you some examples of IQ tests. All right, so let's take a look here. So generally we credit the beginning of IQ testing to these two gentlemen, Theodore Simon and Alfred Binet, going back over 100 years ago, and they were hired by the French government to construct the very first IQ test. The original goal of these tests was to identify the least capable children. So basically what they were doing is attempting to identify the weak students, and then eventually they used it to identify the best students. And basically what they were doing is identifying them to place them in special programs. So thus, in a way, you could argue it's the beginning of special ed, where we're trying to help these children learn and identify what exactly the problem was. However, today we use them much differently. Of course, we do still use them to qualify kids for things like special ed. But what they do is they attempt to measure an individual's probable performance in school and or similar settings. So not only do we use them in the school setting, but they could also be used for example, occupation or job testing, if they can sort of justify that the test correlates or relates to the skills needed and required for the job. So IQ test, as it turns out, is to obviously identify strengths and weaknesses, but also to predict performance. For example, we may want to know how a particular student would be predicted to fare in graduate school, for example. So it gives us an indication of not only their ability to learn, but also the knowledge base that they actually have. So the point is we use them in a very broad sense, not just for school. All right, so what is an IQ? Well, technically, IQ stands for intelligence quotient. So it's a very simple equation that we use to sort of quantify this. So basically, an IQ is the person's mental age, basically meaning the age that they're currently functioning at, which of course could be different from their real age, and that is divided by their chronological age, which is their actual age. That number is then multiplied by 100, and that gives us our IQ score. So for example, if we have a 6-year-old and we give them the test and it turns out that they're functioning at a 6-year-old level, in other words, they're right where we would expect them to be. We times that by 100, so obviously their IQ would be 100. So once again, it's a simple quotient we use to sort of determine that. And what these IQ tests do is allow us to determine that mental age when we compare them to other children and other people. So that is basically what an IQ is. So we mentioned that Binet and Simon constructed the very first IQ test in France. That particular test was incorporated into America, which became the very famous Stanford-Binet IQ test. This was incorporated by Louis Terman, who revised it in English, obviously. He also gave it to the people one-on-one, which is traditionally what we do today. In other words, there would be a psychologist and a student giving the test one-on-one. That allows us to identify strengths and weaknesses, to observe the strategies of the child as they're attacking the different items, for example. In other words, it allows us to gauge what they're doing great, what they're doing not so hot, and anything in between. So it really gives us a clearer estimate of that child's performance. IQ tests, including the Stanford-Binet, a lot of them, use something called adaptive testing, which basically means we're going to test the child at incremental age levels until they make a predetermined amount of errors. So let me kind of back up to explain this one. When the tests are first created, what they do is they randomly sample different ages of children, for example. So let's say we have 5,000 randomly selected 5-year-olds, 5,000 randomly selected 6-year-olds, and so on. We would give each of those groups a set of questions which we think are about their level, and then they answer the questions, and we record how many questions are being answered correctly. So thus, it's giving us an average of what the average 5-year-old could get correct. Thus, the questions that we find in an IQ test cater to those different levels. And so, for example, if the child is 5, we would start off very easy with the, maybe 3, 4-year-old questions, and then work our way up to sort of gauge where they're at. So remember, the goal is to determine their mental age, or what age they're currently functioning at when we compare them to other people. So by sort of evaluating those questions and ordering them, we can get a feel of exactly where they fall in terms of other people. So thus what we mean by this statement is that we give them those questions in that particular order. The child will progress until they cannot go on any further without making mistakes, and thus we would get sort of an indication of where they fall. Psychologists would look at their score and consult a standardized table, which typically comes with the test kit, and that will give us a, basically it'll calculate the mental age for us, and therefore to be able to calculate the IQ. So to kind of show you what I mean, we're going to go to some sample questions here. These are actual questions from the Stanford-Binet IQ test. And as you look at these, you can note that they get progressively harder as we go. So, for example, the 4-year-old questions here are very simple and basic in nature. Why do people live in houses? Birds fly in the air. Fish swim in the... You get the point. They're very simple questions. So they found in the data prior to the test creation that these are the questions that most 4-year-olds could get correct. As we go further, they get harder and harder based on those the data from the samples. So for example, our average 12-year-old could explain what the word regret means, but that would be very difficult for, say, a 4-year-old. So a 4-year-old who could do that would show that they're pretty advanced compared to other children. So in other words, as you see, the questions get more progressively harder, and thus it allows us to sort of gauge where that child falls, or adult being the case, in terms of their mental age. All right, so the next group of IQ tests we're going to look at are the Wechsler test. These particular ones I was personally trained on. I think they're really good tests. And so what we know about the Wechsler test is that there are several versions depending on the age of the subject. So for example, we have the WIPSI, which is primarily for younger children. We have what's called the WISC, Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, which is older children up to age 16 or so. And then if the person is an adult, we would have the WAIS, Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. In other words, those questions would be catered more towards adult level. In other words, it's hard to contain all the questions on a single test, so they do have different versions which sort of cater to the age of the subject we're attempting to measure. Our average IQ on the Wechsler scales is 100, and generally that is true of most IQ tests. The reason we keep the average at 100, you may be wondering it's kind of arbitrary, but basically we use it for comparison purposes. So for example, if the person took the Stanford-Binet and then took the Wechsler, we could basically compare those two scores against each other. So once again, primarily it's for comparison purposes. What I like about the Wechsler scales is they give us not only a general IQ, but they break it down even further into the performance and verbal IQ. So these would be two separate scores. So if you've read the book there, this sort of relates to Cattell's fluid and crystallized intelligence. So in other words, it kind of, once again, pinpoints their strengths and weaknesses in particular areas. We can even go further to break those down into verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory index, and processing speed. So these particular tests will give also an IQ for each of these areas, and therefore it allows the psychologist to pinpoint exactly why this child is not learning or what they are doing exceptionally when we compare them to other people. So for example, they may have a really good working memory, but we may find that their processing speed is lacking and needs attention. So therefore we can cater special ed programs specifically to address those particular needs of the student. One of the major criticisms of the Wechsler scale, as we go to this next one here, is that it is very verbally loaded. In other words, there's lots of instructions. In most cases, the person would have to master the English language to do well in this test, even though there is a Spanish version of the WISC and the Wechsler scales. Some people feel that it does not translate correctly over to Spanish. So what we could do, if that was the case, especially if we thought the person was a second language learner, or we thought there was some sort of language barrier issue, we could opt for something called the Raven's Progressive Matrices, which basically is what we call a culturally fair or culturally reduced IQ test. In other words, what they're basically saying is that it does not require verbal tasks. It's not as specific as the Wechsler scales in terms of specific information. It's very easy to follow, and therefore the person could be limited in their English speaking and still have a fair chance of getting a good score on this particular test. So in other words, they're saying that this particular IQ test is culturally fair and culturally reduced and is fair for most people. Well, how can they claim that? That's a pretty tall order to claim that a test is fair for every single person. So what their justification for this is that the test is basically visual. In other words, it would look something like this rather than like what we would see in the Wechsler scales, whether it be vocabulary and spelling and that kind of thing. Basically, what it's doing is it's looking at spatial and logical reasoning. So in other words, it's really assessing visual skills and logical reasoning skills. So what we would do is ask the person what fits in this particular spot. There's a pattern that goes from left to right here, as you can see. In other words, there's a common pattern going on for each row. So what logically would fit in this particular spot? So as you look at that, guys, most people would agree that it's probably number 8. Because if you look at the rule here, these objects are gradually expanding. So it's small, medium, stretched out, small, medium, stretched out. So logically, 8 would probably fit in that particular spot. Okay, so as you look at these questions, you can kind of see that's the case there. The person would logically sort of respond what particular answer goes in that particular spot. And of course, these get harder as we go. So just to wrap that up, they're saying that this is a culturally fair test because it's not as verbally loaded and dependent on language skills and understanding instructions, for example. It's a pretty basic way to assess intelligence. Critics are going to say, well, yeah, that's true, but is this really assessing intelligence? In other words, is it assessing all areas of intelligence rather than specific areas related to logical reasoning and visual skills? All right, so once again, just a little taste here of different IQ tests and different strategies. Please progress to the next step in the class.